After dropping out of high school and leaving my parents' house, I was in desperate need of work and willing to do almost anything for rent money. Luckily or unluckily, depending on one's perspective, the local cemetery was looking for employees. Initially, the seasoned workers who had been there for decades were skeptical of why a young person would want to be a gravedigger. The job was physically demanding and took a toll on the lower back, but I quickly adjusted and found it to be more like a free gym membership than actual work. I even became quite muscular from the labor. The majority of the cemetery's grounds consisted of standard grave sites, all the same size and price. However, the northwest corner contained a private area with larger plots reserved for wealthier families. The local undertaker profited by selling extravagant grave setups, such as mausoleums and statues of angels, to these families. We rarely ventured into this area except for maintenance and cleaning duties, which were never assigned to me due to the older workers' mistrust of my ability to handle the cleaning chemicals and maintain the marble and brass fixtures. Therefore, it was odd when I received a call on one of my days off, asking if I had been up to the northwest plots recently. My boss was furious and accused me of messing around in that area. I denied it, explaining that the last time I had been there was months ago during my training, watching one of the old-timers clean the marble with chemicals. He let out a sigh and appeared confused and perplexed. I asked him what the problem was, and he responded that it could wait until I returned to work. Although I was concerned, I was confident that I hadn't done anything wrong, at least not intentionally, and certainly nothing involving the northwest plots. A couple of days later, when I arrived at work, the atmosphere was thick with tension. I sensed that something serious had happened, but I didn't need to pester anyone to find out what it was. The boss escorted me silently to the northwest plot, and I refrained from speaking until I found out what was going on. One of the workers was already there tending to one of the graves, and that's when my boss told me that if I had been loitering in the area, eating snacks among the opulent grave sites during my lunch break, now would be the time to confess. I swore that I hadn't been doing anything like that, and I knew better than to eat near the graves. I had been informed that it attracted wild animals, which could damage the resting places. That's when my boss explained that something had attempted to dig up one of the freshly dug graves in the northwest plots. He emphasized that it was something, not someone, because we were all experienced enough to differentiate between graves dug up by tools, by hand, or in this case, by claw. The dirt around the grave had rough edges and obvious claw marks instead of the straight lines created by a shovel. This was a matter of urgency, not only for sanitary reasons, but also for sentimental reasons. If local families discovered that wild animals were trying to unearth their loved ones, there would be an outcry. Something had to be done. A meeting was hastily convened among the gravediggers to discuss the mysterious digging that had been occurring overnight. It was likely the work of a scavenging animal, such as a coyote, black bear, or even an escaped dog. The solution was clear. Night watchmen would need to be stationed in the cemetery every night until the situation was resolved. And who was volunteered to be the night watchman for the first full week? That's right, the young and new guy, me. The only thing that made the proposition even slightly appealing was the fact that anyone working the night shift would be paid double the regular rate, and I could certainly use the extra cash. The first night on watch was miserable. All I had for company was a flask of strong coffee and a .22 pellet gun loaned to me by one of the other workers to fend off any varmints. It was long, boring, and lonely, but once I adjusted my sleeping pattern, it became a little easier. Then, on the second to last night of my watchman duties, I was on a foot patrol, walking towards the northwest plot with a flashlight in hand when I saw it. A flurry of frantic limbs digging at the earth. I could have shouted or even fired the .22 in the air to scare away the animal. But if I killed whatever was causing us so much trouble, I might lose the extra pay. So I crept up slowly, turning off the flashlight and sneaking towards the dark shape working away at the earth. I had hunted rabbits at night with my uncle before, so I figure I used the old flashlight technique to freeze the animal for a moment so I could take the shot. But when I aimed the flashlight in the direction of the digging thing, I almost cried out in fear. It wasn't an animal at all. It was a human, crouched on all fours, digging away at the earth with bare hands. I was too stunned to aim the rifle, as I couldn't believe what I was witnessing. Instead, I made a loud commotion, threatening to call the police and demanding that they leave immediately. Although they did eventually comply, the individual's expression was not one of fear, but rather of pure anger at being caught in their repugnant act. If I hadn't had the rifle with me, and the means to protect myself, I don't think I would have survived that encounter. The other gravediggers were skeptical of my account and what I had seen, though some acknowledged that I had witnessed something peculiar. The police investigation yielded little beyond a few footprints, and the culprit had vanished into the dense tree line beyond my field of vision. Despite the lack of evidence, I am certain that what I saw was a person, and the memory of that disturbing event has haunted me for years. Hi, I'm Sarah, a 20-year-old from North Carolina. Last November, I had the opportunity to visit the Allied war graves in France with my Penn State Contemporary History class, which was exactly 101 years after the armistice of the Great War. This was my first trip outside the U.S., except for a 2-day visit to see my cousin in Toronto, Canada. I was thrilled to explore a little bit of the world beyond the east coast of the U.S. and even learn some basic French to get by. I worked hard, mastering difficult pronunciations and learning basic conversation and asking for directions online. When the time finally came to pack and go to the airport, I was overflowing with anticipation. However, the reality was not as perfect as I had envisioned. Apart from the terrible weather, some French people were unfathomably rude to us as tourists. It made me appreciate the kindness of people in the US even more. Although we might have a few jerks who insist on speaking only English, we don't go around correcting minor mispronunciations, especially if it's a foreigner speaking English. When I asked for directions to the nearest patisserie, I ended up getting a 10-minute grammar lesson from a sour old lady who was one of the less rude ones. Some French people simply ignored me altogether, even though I had asked a question in passable French. They turned and said something like, "I'm sorry, no English." However, I got over it after a while. And it helped that there were a lot of nice French people who made up for all the jerks. However, I was determined to focus on the purpose of my visit, which was to gain first-hand knowledge of history through physical visits. During our trip to a small town called Salraja, my class visited a war cemetery that honored American servicemen who lost their lives defending mainland Europe from the German Kaiser's brutal war machine. This was an American cemetery where more than 6,000 fallen soldiers were interred in a series of plots labeled A to D. Under a blanket of iron-gray clouds, we walked silently among the rows of pristine white crucifixes, each representing an American who had ventured to Europe on a great modern crusade, but did not return. As I walked among the graves, I noticed a man in uniform standing in a small patch of delicately pruned grass that showed no obvious markings of grave sites. This area was marked Plot E, but it was not mapped on the plastic notice board that depicted the locations of the grave sites. There were no mentions of it in the visitor's guide, the English language pamphlets, or even on the cemetery's website. It was as if the plot didn't exist at all. Officially, it didn't. I walked solemnly toward the uniformed man, thinking he must have been some kind of tour guide or reenactor because his fatigues were of the old olive drab worn during World War II. Then, I noticed the 96 white markers, each the size of an index card, carrying only a small ID number with no name or place of birth. They looked more like subterranean filing cabinets than graves, unlike the other plots that had stars and stripes flying and indicated that these were Americans. The whole experience was incredibly saddening, and I couldn't understand why there was a complete lack of respect for these graves. I didn't have to wait long to find out why. "They're buried with their backs facing the other plots," the man said solemnly. "Here, apart from the others, lie the dishonorable dead. He smirked at my confusion. These are U.S. soldiers who were dishonorably discharged before their execution for assaulting or murdering European civilians. I pointed to a small white plaque at the man's feet and asked, "Whose grave is this one?" He smiled, but his gray eyes betrayed a hint of melancholy. "This one belongs to a soldier who was caught poaching on some rich English aristocrat's country estate." An argument ensued, and the landowner received a single gunshot wound to the head. The murderer was a Pennsylvania man named Georgie Smith. He gestured to a pair of small white markers nearby. "And over there are Corporal Clark and Private Guerra, who savagely assaulted and strangled a 15-year-old girl while stationed in the UK. And then there's Louis Till, a black soldier executed for his alleged involvement in the murder of an Italian woman." "Louis Till," I repeated, feeling like I recognized the name. That name sounds so familiar, but for all the wrong reasons. The man nodded. "That's right. He's Emmett Till's father, hanged on foreign soil while his son was only 3 years old." It was a dark foreshadowing of Emmett's own death just 11 years later. I was in shock. Emmett Till, whose mother held an open casket funeral to show the world how terribly her son had been treated in his final moments. I couldn't imagine the pain she must have felt, losing her husband and son in such similar unjust ways. As the man spoke, I couldn't help but feel like Emmett's fate had been decided long before his death. It was a deeply disturbing realization that made me question everything I thought I knew about the world. Was there really some sort of plan, God's or the devil's, that doomed certain people from birth? It was the most intensely creepy fact I'd ever come to terms with, and it left me wondering if some people truly were just destined for a tragic end. I am from Hong Kong and work at Pak Folam Cemetery, one of the most densely populated burial grounds in the world. Constructed in 1882, this private cemetery on the western side of Hong Kong Island is an awe-inspiring sight. Even though I have lived here all my life, its grandeur has never lost its appeal. The cemetery is built into the mountainside, with terraced steps and interconnected staircases that give it the appearance of an enormous outdoor amphitheater. My story begins just before the King Ming Festival, also known as Tomb Sweeping Day. This festival, dating back 2,000 years to the Han Dynasty, occurs in early April. On this day, families visit their loved ones' grave sites to clean them as a sign of respect and remembrance. It is also a status symbol, as the family with a well-maintained grave is considered the most prestigious. Due to the overcrowding at the cemetery, where families can pay over $30,000 for the privilege of being buried there, some years we have to do significant amounts of work before the family visits commence. Unfortunately, this work is not always pleasant. Last April, I was assigned the task of moving some remains into newer grave sites to make room for those who had paid large sums for the most attractive burial sites. Moving a person's remains goes against cultural taboos, and it was considered to be one of the most arduous tasks that I or my colleagues had ever undertaken. Wrapped in layers of protective clothing on some of the hottest and most humid days of the year, we had to be extremely careful not to lose even a speck of dust or bone while transporting remains up and down hundreds of stairs. One early morning, I donned my mask, goggles, and forensic suit, a combination that we have a Cantonese name for, but can be translated accurately to English, and began my task. My objective was to break the seal of a very old and unkempt grave, which we needed to move entirely along with the remains. Every piece had to stay intact and undamaged, which meant I had to work 8 hours straight just to complete this task. The family of the deceased had accepted money from a wealthier family for this particular grave, which gave them the resources to spruce up the gravesite a little. However, the name on the headstone had been worn away by the elements over the years, so I hoped the family would invest in making the grave more presentable. The following day, I started bagging up the remains, which turned out to be a painstaking process. I had to collect every individual bone after breaking through the rotten wooden coffin that housed the body. It dawned on me that this task was challenging not only because it made me reflect on death, but also because it was like piecing together a broken-down Lego set that could never be reconstructed. It was horrific to pick through the long-dead person's bones, singling out each small piece and placing them into the corresponding plastic bag. This experience made me think about how temporary and fleeting our lives are and how fragile we are. Although parts of us stick around long after we're gone, it's not the pieces we would have hoped for. Working around a cemetery all day, 5 days a week, makes you reflect on death. But our jobs mostly involve maintenance and cleaning tasks, so it's easy to distract oneself with smaller jobs. However, it's not possible to compartmentalize so effectively when faced with another human's corpse. I want to start by saying that I'm not a believer in supernatural or paranormal events. I'm aware that there must be a rational explanation for what happened to me, but I just can't seem to find it. After I started my work at the cemetery, I began having strange dreams. In these dreams, I would be working, and suddenly, a young woman would approach me. She was a beautiful lady, taller than most girls in Hong Kong, and dressed in a traditional Chinese style instead of the Western fashion that's more popular among younger people. The dreams were so vivid that I woke up with her name, Leon K., on my lips. I couldn't stop thinking about her the next day. The dreams continued for a few nights, and then stopped. It wasn't until we had to restore the engraving and painting on a tombstone that I realized something odd. We had to search through old handwritten databases to find the name of the person buried there. The tomes were huge and thick, and we found the meticulous organization of these records very helpful in finishing our task quickly. When I first read the records of the remains, I was certain I had made a mistake. The family name Li and middle name Yan were the first words that caught my attention. It immediately reminded me of the girl who had been appearing in my recurring dreams. She was a beautiful lady who used to visit her ancestors' graves, and I wondered if there was any connection between them. As I continued reading, my heart sank as I anticipated the next name to be K. Luckily, it wasn't, and the name turned out to be Fong. The deceased person I had been moving was named Li Yan Fong. However, the coincidence of the family and middle name of the girl in my dreams and the deceased person was far too eerie to ignore. The dreams slowly faded away after the remains were moved and the grave was sealed. Although I tried to rationalize what had happened, it still creeps me out and makes me feel uncomfortable. Nonetheless, I firmly believe that it was just my way of processing the stress and agony of moving a dead person's remains. As a 16-year-old caretaker for a rural cemetery in Georgia, my summertime job was fairly straightforward. I cleaned the dirt and grime off the tombstones and maintained the site's cleanliness. The cemetery itself consisted of flat earth with tombstones spread across the area, except for one building that served as the bathroom for the 5 caretakers employed by the cemetery. The surroundings were dense forests, which added to the eerie feeling of the place. I was always a little paranoid while working there, probably due to watching too many horror movies. One night, while doing my rounds, I had to go into the small mausoleum where some of the wealthier families in the area were entombed. I had to ensure that everything was neat and tidy, meeting the standards of these uptight folks. As I approached the building, I sensed that something was amiss. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I had a feeling that I wasn't alone. Then I noticed candlelight coming from the mausoleum, and I heard voices from inside, giggling and laughing. It sounded like younger voices, kids my age, but it didn't seem particularly wholesome. I hadn't seen anyone enter or leave the cemetery, but I wasn't about to confront a group of potentially drunk teenagers on my own. So I called the lone security officer on duty, who did a few rounds on the lot. He was an elderly, retired police officer, but he still possessed a tough demeanor. When the ex-cop finally arrived, he readily offered his assistance. We ventured inside the building, but it was empty, which made no sense since I had just heard voices and seen candles lit around one of the tombs. Upon further investigation, we discovered an open tomb that contained the remains of a child-sized skeleton. Although nothing else seemed disturbed, the presence of a rotting child's doll, like the knitted kind, was enough to unsettle us. The doll was hand in hand with the actual child's skeleton, and its eerie smile was incredibly disturbing. The security guard and I quickly left the area, performing a rapid sweep of the grounds in the hope of finding the culprits who had desecrated the child's final resting place. Unfortunately, we didn't encounter anyone, which was more exasperating than frightening. After a brief quarter hour, we returned to the mausoleum to restore the child's grave by sliding the stone tablet back into place. However, we found the doll, which was previously hand in hand with the deceased girl, sitting upright on the opposite side of the mausoleum. Someone had moved it there to taunt us. The experience was too much for me to bear, and I decided to quit the next day, never returning to that place, even to visit. As a former funeral director, let me set the scene. There's an ancient cemetery nearby that dates back several hundred years, evidenced by the church next to it that was built in the 17th century. In the past, most burials consisted of wooden crosses, and as time passed, they deteriorated and were replaced by new burials. Nowadays, due to the remote rural location, the cemetery's budget is limited and it's become overgrown and rundown. Despite its desolate appearance, the cemetery has a certain eerie beauty. However, the soil has been worked over countless times over the centuries, resulting in bone meal as the primary component. The soil now resembles the light-colored dirt found near sandy beaches, but upon closer inspection, it's just bone fragments instead of crushed seashells. It's a grim reality that one must come to accept and treat any recognizable human remains with the utmost respect, tucking them away out of sight. Recently, someone was caring for a loved one's grave and decided to remove the grass and level the area, creating Zen garden-like lines with a rake. While doing so, they discovered a bunch of snow-white hair in the dirt, which was unexpected and unsettling. It appears that someone had a fright and ran away, leaving the cemetery attendant to discover hair protruding from the ground. She reported it to the church, which supposedly reburied the remains. Despite my years of experience as an undertaker, I'm uncertain how a body could be so close to the surface. However, there's another occurrence that still haunts me more than this one. My business partner and I had just returned to the funeral home after tending to a 27-year-old woman who had died from terminal cancer. While transferring her body from the stretcher to an embalming table, we heard an audible click, and the old radio across the room turned on to full volume of static. We both turned pale and looked at each other. My partner, who was deeply religious, was visibly shaken, and he found an excuse to leave early. I switched off the radio since I preferred listening to music on my iPhone while performing embalming tasks. However, while moving the woman's body from the embalming table to a dressing table, I heard the same click from the radio, and it turned on to full volume again. At this point, I was thoroughly spooked and quickly left. My partner and I never discussed it again, and I never experienced anything similar before or after that incident.